Comrades, this is when I was told to do this, it suddenly struck me it's a funny topic. The state capitalist ruling class. It's not really, everybody presumably wants to know which one, because there's quite a number of them. In fact, it's crucial to the theory of state capitalism that there are many state capitalist ruling classes. There are many capitals and so on. So, what I'm going to talk about is, I'm going to do a partly theoretical talk about the form, what we mean by state capitalism in general, and then I'm going to go on and look at a particular case, which is the one I know most about, which is Poland. And in fact, if you ask me about anywhere else, I probably won't know. So I'll say something about the theory of the state capitalist ruling class and its relationship to the development of Marxist class theory, because that's the theme of this course. And then I'm going to look at the development of one case, which is Poland, bearing in mind that all other cases are different, just like all the Western capitalist ruling classes are different. So the state capitalist ruling classes in the different quote-unquote communist countries, third world countries and so on are all different in particular ways in their own particular countries for historical reasons. And I'll just end with a few remarks about the future. Now, if you begin with Marx's Capital is famously an unfinished work. In fact, in the subject of this course, the manuscript breaks off just as Marx is about to tell us what he thinks about class. And the incompleteness of Capital is posed very dramatically for us when we consider the 20th century, when the system that Marx was describing has become much more complete than it was in Marx's own time. It's become a worldwide system. Nigel Harris was saying last night, we are now entering the period, he put it, of world capitalism. And clearly, although Marx talked about world capitalism in the 19th century, it's much more obviously world capitalism in the 20th. Capitalism is much more developed, much more complete as a system than it was in Marx's time. What's particularly sad, I think, is the fact that Marx planned a whole series of extra volumes that he never even got round to drafting, as far as we know. Not even a note is left about what was going to be in them, apart from a few remarks in the Grundrisse. And two of those volumes, it's a real tragedy we don't have. One of them was to be called The State, and another one was to be called The World Market and Crises. And I'm sure we would have been very interested to know what Karl Marx had to say about those two questions in detail, really systematically worked out, but we don't. Now, one thing I think is clear, and that is that if Marx had completed, if he'd lived to complete, if he had completed the whole work that he planned, then he would have had to modify the preface to Volume 1 that he published in 1867. Because in that preface he said, speaking to Germans, he said, don't think, he took all his examples from England, and he said, don't think that when I'm talking about England, I'm not talking about you. In fact, he said, every country can see in England its own future. The advanced country, he says, shows to the backward the picture of its own future. And then he had this Latin tag, De te fabula narrata, which for those of you who haven't got Latin O-level, means the same story is going to be told about you, as was told about England. Now, if there's one thing that I think is clear from the history of capitalism in the 100 years and more since Marx wrote Capital, it is that the rest of the world has not followed the pattern of England. The pattern of capitalist development in England has not been followed anywhere else at all. England was the most peculiar pattern of capitalist development in the history of the development of capitalism. There was a very simple reason why, because England was the first. And every country that had capitalist industrial development afterwards had to develop its capitalist industry in the shadow of an already existing dominant capitalism. And that shaped the form in which all the others had to develop. There's a slogan of Stalin's when he launched state capitalism in Russia in 1929. He said, we must catch up and overtake the West or they will destroy us. Now he was not the first person to think in those terms. The French thought in those terms in the middle of the 19th century. The language they used to describe it in the period of the Emperor Louis Bonaparte III in the mid-1850s was the language which they thought of as that some of them thought was socialist language. It was the language of Saint-Simon. It was the followers of Saint-Simon, the utopian socialist, who set up the Credit Mobilier Bank to mobilize using state and big financial resources to form a center of accumulation in order to develop industry in competition with the English. In Germany, the big banks from the beginning, much more centralized institutions than in England, centralized savings to develop industry. It was a much more centralized pattern of industrialization. In Tsarist Russia, in the later 19th century, there's a big development of industry, which of course is the whole part of the background to the Russian Revolution, the existence of the proletariat in Russia. Who carried through the industrialization? Largely the Tsarist state. Financed, borrowed money on the French market and so on, and financed, the state financed, a large part of the industrialization of Russia. In Japan, after what was called the Meiji Restoration in 1868, it was in fact a group of samurai bureaucrats from the old regime, the pre-capitalist regime, who pulled Japan into the world of capitalism and began to develop capitalism in Japan in competition with the rest of the world. And they used the resources of the state. The initial industries that were built in Japan in the 1870s were built by the state. They were financed by the state, and later they were sold off to the big, what were called the zaibatsu, the money cliques in Japan. So state capitalism is not simply a theory about Russia, it's a theory about the whole pattern of capitalist development after England. I think we have to be clear about this, because otherwise we think it's a special theory about Eastern Europe, or Russia, or something like that. Okay, now all of this tremendous increasing involvement of the state and of centralized institutions like the big banks and so on, in the development of capitalism was registered, of course, in Marxist theory very clearly at the time of the First World War. You read Lenin's Imperialism. It's all about exactly that. You read even more clearly Bukharin's book on imperialism and world economy, and it's centered on the proposition that there are two processes going on in the world simultaneously. The process he calls of nationalization, of the formation, he says, in fact, of state capitals in the world. He's looking at the German war economy, he's looking at the British war economy, and so on. Tremendous process of state centralization, of nationalization going on. You can't understand it, he says, unless you understand the other tendency in the world, which is the tendency towards, as he puts it, internationalization, the spread of capitalism to the whole globe, so that the whole globe is defined increasingly by competition between the great centers of accumulation in the major capitalist powers. Now, Lenin and Bukharin were absolutely clear about two things, and there were two propositions which they'd inherited from Marx. The two propositions were these. The first one is, and this is words that Marx and Engels used. Marx and Engels talked about the socialization of production under capitalism. Socialization is not a slogan simply of socialism. Capitalism, as it develops production, said Marx and Engels, socializes production. Workers who were originally in small individual workshops and so on are centralized into great collective production processes. The material basis, in other words, for socialism is laid within capitalism. Workers are drawn into great productive and distributive centers and so on, cities. There's a tremendous socialization of life within capitalism. There's a tremendous socialization of the world, as the whole world is drawn into one system, and every part of the world is now unified into a single system. I think the last tiny group of people were forced into world capitalism about 10 years ago. In New Guinea, an explorer found a tiny tribe of people living in a cave. There were about 30 of them. They didn't know there were any other human beings on Earth. They had their photographs taken, and somebody gave them a Coca-Cola. They're finished. It's the end of the last independent society on Earth that we know about. I mean, maybe there's somebody living down in the Antarctic tundra, though I doubt it. Everybody is now part of a single system. Now, Marx and Engels and Lenin and Bukharin, absolutely clear, capitalism socializes production to a tremendous extent. That's the first proposition, but the second proposition is that the socialization which capitalism carries out is the development of capitalism. It is not socialism. Capitalist socialization is not socialism, and there are a whole number of people who regard themselves as socialists who make a mistake of thinking that many of the forms of capitalist socialization are actually socialism. You know, meet an orthodox Trotskyist and you've met somebody who believes that. Now, or quote-unquote orthodox Trotskyist. Now, if we talk about Trotsky, I want to mention Trotsky because, in a sense, we all come out of the Trotskyist tradition. I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing what's wrong with Trotsky's theory, but I think we have to be clear that Trotsky, on the one hand, gave the most brilliant recognition to, in a sense, what was missing in Marx's Capital. What is not present in Marxist Capital as a developed theory is a theory of combined and uneven development. And Trotsky, because he was trying to explain what was peculiar about Tsarist Russia, from 1905 onwards, Trotsky develops a theory of combined and uneven development. Tsarist Russia has developed capitalism in a way quite different from Britain, he says. Why? precisely because it is in a world. It is not simply this uneven development, difference between development in different countries. The development is combined and uneven. What makes it combined is the fact that the rest of the world is developing all around Tsarist Russia, forcing the Tsarist Russian regime, in fact, to undermine its own foundations by developing capitalist development, developing a working class, and so on. Now, that was Trotsky's absolutely a brilliant contribution by Trotsky, centered on his account of Tsarism. In a sense, though, and out of it, of course, came something that is the subject for other discussions elsewhere, Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. You can't have Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution without his theory of combined and uneven development. But there's a weakness in Trotsky's theory. It's very important that we recognize there's a weakness in Trotsky's theory. He never generalized his insights into Tsarism to the rest of the world. He treated Tsarism as the special case, but he didn't generalize his understanding of Tsarism to the whole development of world capitalism. And what I mean by that is this very simple proposition, which is absolutely fundamental to our understanding of state capitalism. And that is that he never understood, or at least he seems never to have understood, that capitalist development could be carried through under the rule of a class of people who didn't personally own the capital. Therefore, he couldn't understand Stalinism in Russia. His theory about Stalinism can't grasp that. The theory of the degenerated worker state, the core of it is a failure to recognize that the Communist Party in Russia could be the capitalist, that the state in Russia could be the capitalist. Always there's the assumption in Trotsky, when you say capitalism, you mean private, almost, if you like, personal private property. That other forms of capitalist development in that sense don't exist within Trotsky. And unless we can grasp that, then we can't understand just about anything about the 20th century world. We have to grasp that and understand it. It's the central implication of a whole series of positions that we take. Example, you can't understand Cliff's theory of deflected permanent revolution. And of course, orthodox Trotskyists can't understand Cliff's theory of deflected permanent revolution. Because what's the theory say? When the proletariat fails to carry through, for particular historical reasons, fails to carry through the process of revolution in a backward country, that does not mean, as Trotsky's theory suggested, there could be no process of development, there could be no national revolution. On the contrary, they have happened all over the place. But another class was able to step in and take the place of the proletariat. And what did it do? It pursued capitalist development in practice. Who were those people? Were they the capitalists? The people with the money? No. Time and again, they were state officials, or people who wanted to be state officials. What Cliff calls the petty bourgeois intelligentsia. The leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Sometimes the military, like the NASA. Junior military officers like NASA in Egypt, and so on. All sorts of different people can play that role. They haven't got a personal, if you like, pocketbook stake in the process. That they personally own the capital, they do it in the name of national economic development. That Trotsky doesn't understand. Unless you grasp that capital can take other forms than purely personal private property, I'll come back to the question of private property in a different way in a moment, you can't understand developments in advanced Western capitalism. You can't understand the development of nationalized property, for example. Now, it is not only you're actually completely at sea. If you think that nationalization is always something to do with socialism, you really find yourself with fantastic difficulties when you look at the Western capitalism. How do you explain de Gaulle nationalizing number of industries in France after the war? De Gaulle, as far as I remember him, was not a famous leftist. How do you explain Mussolini in the 1930s, another famous revolutionary socialist? Actually, he was at one time. It's slightly different in his case, before the First World War. How do you explain someone like Mussolini, the fascist dictator, nationalizing whole sector of Italian industry? How do you explain Franco nationalizing a whole sector of industry? How do you explain the fact that the South African regime has a big nationalized sector, etc., etc., etc.? Second, and what's clear, I don't know if anybody's here from the National Union of Mine Workers, but it's fairly clear, I think, that if you look at something like the National Coal Board, it's a pretty standard capitalist outfit. It exploits the workers, it's in competition with other coal industries in the rest of the world. The bosses of the coal industry behave exactly like capitalists anywhere, particularly ruthless breed of them, in fact. Now McGregor, it's true, gets paid a lot for his services, but he doesn't own a share in the National Coal Board. In fact, in purely theoretical terms, we own the National Coal Board. We own the railways. Have you ever tried to ride on your railways without paying? On your buses or whatever? Now, what's interesting is that Marx and Engels themselves in the 19th century had already dealt with this question, though not in any developed way. You find Engels in Anti-Düring writing that if socialism is about nationalization, then the Emperor Napoleon was the first socialist because he nationalized the French tobacco industry. Gitan and Gaulois, if you have illusions in the state, and you're that sort of socialist, then you can get yourself cancer through socialism from French cigarettes. They're all nationalized. Marx, in fact, in a fairly late thing he wrote called his Notes on Adolf Wagner, wrote quite specifically about nationalized mines and forests was the example he took. He said these are perfectly orthodox capitalist enterprises. Now, the question is, why did the state play the part of capital in a whole number of countries in different ways? Why does it continue to do so? And I think the answer, quite simply, is something else which is not developed in Marxist Capital, and which, had he gone on to write volume 5 or whatever it was that where he was going to deal with these questions, is that there's no discussion in Marx about tax. Marx discusses value being converted into price. He talks about the different forms of capital. He talks about finance capital, how it takes a share of surplus value. He talks about the landlord and rent and how the landlord takes a slice of surplus value. He talks about the merchant capital sector and how they take a slice of surplus value, but he never talks about the state and how it takes a slice of surplus value through its particular power, which is, of course, the power of its army and its tax officers and so on. Simply its physical power in society, in a sense. The state has got a particular relationship to capitalist society, which is that it's got force on its side in a way that the conventional capitalist doesn't have. And it can therefore extract resources from society, as it were, by non-economic means. Now, that gives the state a power to do things which other institutions in capitalist society don't have, to extract part of surplus value and accumulate it and reinvest it in line with the state's own determination of what it thinks society needs and so on. Now, that's central to the development, what Marx's account of primitive accumulation in volume 1 of Capital, when he talks about how capitalism was first created. Force, he says, is the midwife of history. You have to be clear that force has been the midwife of capital accumulation through the state in country after country after country, and it still continues to be so. And it's very important for understanding the whole workings of capitalism that the state plays that part in the workings of, in the development of capitalism. Okay, now, the theory of state capitalism requires that we spell out several implications, really, that are missing in most Marxist discussions of the state. And I'm going to just run through them very quickly. The first of the implications which we need to pull out is that the state is not simply something outside capitalist production relations. It's part of them. It isn't simply something, there are a whole number of Marxist theorists in Germany and elsewhere who did a lot of work in the 1970s about trying to rediscover and develop the Marxist theory of the state. And all of them, almost without exception, talked about the state as something side by side with capital, but outside the capitalist production process. That's an incredibly dated account of the real relationship of the state to capitalist development, capitalist production. It's part of the process of capitalist production. Secondly, to talk about the state, and very often, I had to write an article for the journal, The State, in which somebody wrote a letter saying he's Colin Barker an anarchist and so on, but never mind about that. To talk of the state, as we often do, the Marxist theory of the state, is of course completely wrong. Because there is not the state anywhere. There are many states in reality within capitalism. And we can't really have an adequate theory of capitalism and the state unless we begin almost from the proposition that capitalism is divided globally into many states, all of which are in competition with each other through war, through trade, etc., etc. And that's a crucial part of the definition of the state. The state doesn't only dominate a particular sector of the world and a particular population that it calls its own people, but it also competes with all other states in the world. And we can't understand the behavior of states and the way capitalist states react to situations and so on unless we recognize that. And if we want to understand the state, we have to start from the totality, the world, which is divided into many states, in order to understand the behavior of each state. Now, third proposition is this, that when we talk about private property, we don't simply mean property attached to an individual or a family or something like that. What I think we have to say we mean by private property is non-communal property. Property which is not everybody's. The air is the only thing probably in capitalism which is not private property in that sense. And if we say that, then we can see that in history there have been other kinds of private property which have also been not belonging to individuals but nonetheless not communal. You look at the Egypt of the pharaohs, for example. Actually, there's very little in the way of, if you like, what we normally think of as private property existing in the Egypt of the pharaohs. What there is a state-directed, state class which exploits society. It's not a capitalist class, it's a pre-capitalist class. Marx sometimes used a phrase like the Asiatic mode of production to describe it. I don't want to go into that, but in fact, if you ask me to, I won't be able to. But it doesn't matter. The idea, in general, is there, and it's quite clear in the case of Egypt of the pharaohs that you can have a state organizing the exploitation of a class of peasants and slaves. Similarly, amongst the Incas and all sorts of other places in the world, that the state can be an exploiting class. Another example from a different setting, not of a state, but of a non-private owning exploiting class. You look at the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. The biggest landowner in feudal Europe is the church. Now, it is actually the case, if you think about it, the bishop who you might think owns the land can't pass it on to his son. In fact, he's not supposed to have a son. Strictly, there's no personal property relationship. The power of the individual member of the church and his ability to exploit the peasants on the church's estates, and they were exploited just as badly on the church's estates as on the knights and nobles' estates, that power comes from the possession of the office in the church. Right? The Catholic Church is the biggest single exploiter in Western Europe, and yet there's no private property. In the orthodox sense. There is, of course, institutional private property, as any peasant would tell you. It's not ours, it belongs to the bloody church. Actually, they didn't say the bloody church. Unfortunately, they were filled up with religious ideas and so on, but never mind. So the state can be, I think we have to be quite clear, the state itself can be a ruling class. We have to be very sure about that and determined about it, otherwise we can't understand the world at all. Okay. Now, if we're going to say that a particular state class is a capitalist ruling class. Now, as soon as we say that, we're saying something else. We're defining the social relationships within a particular society that shape that ruling class. What must it do if it's a capitalist class? It must behave like the capitalists that Marx described in Capital. What is its central drive? It must, as Marx put it, accumulate, accumulate. That's the dynamic which it's driven by its competition with other capitalists in the world to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. That, Marx is Moses and all the prophets. It's Moses and all the prophets. As much for Jaruzelski in Poland or Nyerere in Tanzania as it is for Henry Ford. Accumulate, accumulate. What does accumulate, accumulate mean? Exploit, exploit. Suck surplus value out of your population in order to reinvest, 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 in order to exploit, exploit, exploit on an expanded scale, in order to compete. The same central relationships which define capital define, of course, the behavior of a state capitalist class. So, what they're fueled by, in a sense, the motor of their economies is accumulation in order to survive. An endless race in which they're involved. An endless race. There's an East German writer called Barrow who, although he doesn't hold the theory of state capitalism, in a sense he almost came to it when he said at one point that it's like a race between the hare and the tortoise, in which the hare, every time the hare rests, the tortoise calls from in front, "I'm here now, you must catch up again." And that's the endless pressure on a backward country, for example. That always the advanced sector is moving further and further ahead, therefore the process is endless. The need to accumulate, exploit, reinvest, accumulate, and so on and so on. Now, when we say accumulation, we sometimes think of accumulation as if it's something, which is sort of, that's to do with economics. And then over here, there's politics. They're two different things. One, here's accumulation. That's something we talk about in Marxist economics and so on and so on. And there's something else entirely called the class struggle and politics and so on. But actually, if you think about it, accumulation is the class struggle. That's the heart of the idea of accumulation is a process of class struggle, of a capitalist class constantly involved in being forced to squeeze surplus value out of the sweat and the brains of workers in order to reinvest it, in order that they can carry on exploiting them on an expanded scale. It is the process of class struggle. The heart of the process of the capitalist class struggle is accumulation. It's what goes on in the factories. What do workers resist? Accumulation. because that's everything that they're resisting is tied into accumulation. Now, it's very important that we understand this, because there's one thing which no other theory of Russia and Eastern Europe than our own, no other theory can explain about those economies, can give an adequate explanation of, and that is why it is that all those economies have experienced immense economic development. See, it's actually, we have to explain it. Why actually was there enormously rapid industrialization under Stalin? Why was there? Now, Trotsky, I don't want to talk about the alternative theories. All the others are mystical. There's no other theory explains it. No other theory explains why the form that rapid industrialization took under Stalin, or say in Eastern Europe after the war, in every country in Eastern Europe after the war, big crash industrialization programs. Why was all the emphasis on heavy industry and on the production of military goods? They can't explain it. They can't explain the real history of those countries. They can't explain why there's been a huge development, therefore, of a modern working class in all of those countries. Why it is that the rulers of those countries hold down the consumption of the working class in those countries. Why they subordinate the consumption of workers in those countries to the ever-pressing demand for more and more accumulation. None of that can they explain. We're the only ones who can explain it. We really ought to be going around shouting from the housetops about our theory, because we're the only ones who can explain the world with our theory. Now, that means, of course, that our theory also says the whole processes in all of those societies are defined as processes of class struggle. From the beginning, they're processes of class struggle. And that's central to our understanding of them. There is an antagonism between classes in those countries which defines the center of politics, the center of everything, of life in those countries. Everything else that you say about the ruling classes in those countries, the empirical data that you start to collect about them, about their privileges, for example, is secondary. The key thing about those ruling classes is that they accumulate, they exploit, they seek to develop in a capitalist form. Okay. Now, it's through the struggle to accumulate and to exploit, in other words, through the class struggle, that the state capitalist ruling class in any country develops. It's through the struggle to accumulate and exploit, through the class struggle, that every state capitalist ruling class is shaped in the way that it's actually organized in a particular country. And it's just as true of Poland or Czechoslovakia or Bulgaria or China as it is of Britain or the United States or France. I mean, we know very well the American ruling class is shaped by the process of class struggle. We also have to know it about Yugoslavia. Now, in other words, the process, you can say, put it another way, you can say the process of development in those countries of the ruling class is a development through a process of crisis. Crisis and all the forms of crisis that are generated through capitalist production. As a matter of fact, I mean, there isn't time to go into this, but if you look empirically at the development of any of those countries, and I can only do it for Poland, you can see very clearly that all of those countries suffer from all the main features that we find in capitalist economies. They suffer from falling growth rates. They suffer from a falling rate of profit. They suffer from trade cycles, or certainly cycles of production. Whether we call them trade cycles, certainly their production goes up and down in cycles. We find that they have increasing problem about their technology gap with the West. We find that they've got increasing balance of payments problems and debt problems and so on, like 101 other countries in the world. Also, we talk about the politics of them, and I want just to end really by saying something about that side of it. The political forms of the state capitalist ruling class, the way they organize themselves, and then the way they reorganize themselves in response to a crisis, is a response to class struggle and the pressures of accumulation, and therefore of competition. Now, I'm just going to end really by trying to illustrate this with a little bit of stuff about Poland since the war. And it's going to have to be very sketchy, and if comrades want to come back and develop it, fine. I probably can't. The new ruling class that was installed in Poland after the war was not really something that came naturally out of Poland. It almost came in on the back of the Red Army's tanks. You have to understand that even the Polish Communist Party, the leadership of the Polish Communist Party before the war, was liquidated by Stalin. There was no independent Communist Party leadership of any significance in Poland after the war, which was not attached to the Kremlin. They were all, in a sense, they were really the Kremlin's boys speaking Polish, the Polish-speaking Kremlin boys, Stalin's boys. And initially, the first period of development of state capitalism in Poland, if you look at the ruling class in Poland, they're really quite a small group. It's not a huge class, it's really quite a small class of people. Kuron and Modzelewski, if you read their superb pamphlet from the 1960s, The Open Letter to the Party, when they're discussing the class structure of Poland, they call them the central political bureaucracy. And who are they talking about? Essentially, they're talking about a group of people with their families, maybe no more than 10 to 20, 30, 40,000. Quite a small, cohesive group of people who form the leadership of the state, that's to say of the army, the police, the different ministries of the state, the main economic ministries, the heads of the very biggest industrial combines, and the party, the leadership of the party. It's quite a small group at the top. And they are the people who forced through, backed up by Russian military might, of course, and by the fragmentation of Polish society beneath them, which made it all possible, they forced through the initial process of crash industrialization. If any of you have seen Andrzej Wajda's marvelous film, Man of Iron, Man of Marble, he has a wonderful portrait of the Stalinist period, the early industrialization of post-war Poland. Of crash industrialization, workers former peasants being sucked into the towns, into the industrial areas in very large numbers, a new raw working class being created, where previously Poland was a very backward country before the war. Mostly peasants, some town and industrial development, but not very much. There's this crash industrialization process forced through by the state. Millions of workers, a million-headed working class created for the first time in Poland, much bigger than there's ever been in terms of working class before. And a tremendous process, therefore, of mobility within Polish society, everybody moving and changing. Even the borders, in the case of Poland, even the borders changed, of course. The Polish borders all shifted to the west. Part of what had been Germany became Poland. Part of what had been Poland was lost to Russia. There was a tremendous tide of population which was moved right across Poland from one place to the other. They just occupied empty lands that had been previously German, and so on, in Silesia and in the western part of Poland. The city of Stettin, which was the center of a big strike movement in 1970, that was Stettin of Germany in 1945. Or Wrocław of Poland today, a big industrial center, that was Breslau of Germany before the war and during the war. So there's a tremendous movement. Therefore, if you like, you've got an enormously disorganized population and a very cohesive ruling class forcing through crash industrialization. It's also, of course, the case that in that situation where you've got very rapid industrial and economic development, there's lots of room for enterprising, keen, intelligent people, young people from the villages and so on who leave for the town. They experience an improvement in their conditions of life, not necessarily materially, but in their whole sense that life is getting better. They're going to a town, they're helping to build a big block of flats, they're helping to build power stations, steel mills and so on. In many senses, many parts of Polish society, I mean, there's a tremendous process of exploitation going on. Many sectors of Polish society really identify with it. We really are constructing socialism in our country. It's like the same sort of feeling that existed in many third world countries in the 60s. You know, now we are independent of the colonial regime, we've got our own government. You know, the movement, with a certain period of identification with national economic development and so on and so on. Especially amongst the intelligentsia. Whole new layer of students being created, crash courses in universities, new opportunities for them, new layer of white-collar workers created, all sorts of sense of opportunities. There are people who are completely opposed to the regime today, who are older, who look at that period, you know, because they lived through it, and they say the truth is, looking back, the very best of our generation was sold the idea of Stalinist industrialization. You know, people now who are dissidents, for example, I mean, like Kolakowski, who's now abroad, who's a liberal these days. But Kolakowski was a keen young member of the Communist Party, out to build socialism in Poland, etc., etc. However, the initial crash industrialization drive began to run into all the contradictions that crash industrialization drives do run into. There isn't time to talk about it. The primitive accumulation process can go so far, it starts to run into the sand. The rate of growth began to slow down. And then on top of that comes Khrushchev's secret speech in Russia, which of course reverberates through Eastern Europe. There's a split developing because of the slowing down of economic growth. There's a split developing within the central political bureaucracy. increasing uncertainty about what to do, uncertainty about how exactly to respond to the situation that's changing in Russia. Stalin died in 1953, then comes Khrushchev's speech in 1956. Take those plus increasing workers' discontent once they've arrived in town and they've been there for a few years. Okay, well, life, it was very good moving from the village to the town, but it's about time now that life in the town started to get a bit better. We want more wages, we want improvement in working conditions, we want to spend less time building bloody steel mills and a bit more time constructing and improving flats, etc., etc. And in 1956, there is the first real, apart from East Berlin in 1953, the first major upsurge of workers' struggle in Eastern Europe, in two places, in Poland, of course, and in Hungary in the Hungarian Revolution. Big movement in Poland in 1956, beginning in the big new industrial city, more or less created where there'd been nothing before, nothing more than a very small town, Poznan. Whole new industrial city erupts. Workers fight the police on the streets and the army on the streets. They burn down the party headquarters. Hundreds are killed in a big battle with the police. And the whole party is thrown into turmoil. It's the first crisis in Poland, the major first crisis of this regime. And, hang on, I've lost where I am. You see, all the opposition, however, that developed in 1956, all of it, including the workers mostly, managed to identify its hopes with what it saw as the reform wing of the party, what called itself the reform wing of the party. The Poles were lucky. There was a guy called Gomulka who'd been arrested during the Stalinist purges in the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s, on the grounds that he was a nationalist, which was perfect for Poland in 1956. He got his nationalist badge, as it were. He's a real Pole against the Russians, because the Poles hate the Russians, for good reasons. And he hadn't been executed. Now, unlike all the others in the rest of Eastern Europe, Reich and others, in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and so on, there were purges and the leaders of the Communist Party were shot. Gomulka was not shot. He was imprisoned, but it happened Stalinism in Poland, for whatever reason, was a bit softer than in most of the rest of Eastern Europe. And he hadn't been shot, and so they pulled him out of prison, and suddenly there's a folk hero. He comes straight to the leadership, back into the leadership of the Communist Party, says, I am for reform, workers' councils, etc., rides the tide, and manages gradually then to push the workers' councils in the factories back into being nothing, looking after watering the flowers in the director's boardroom, as one worker put it. After a period of struggle, gradually the struggle dampens down, the party is back in the saddle with a new leadership, and so on. But the leadership, the ruling class in Poland, that small group, had a big fright. It's quite clear they'd had a very big fright, because what they discovered was how isolated they were when there's a mass struggle. They'd been saved by the skin of their teeth from a rerun in Poland of the Hungarian Revolution. And what do you do if you feel extremely isolated? The truth is, you look for allies. And there's an obvious set of allies to look for them to look for. And that's the next layer below them, which is very much bigger. 50,000 people, perhaps 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people, it's far too few if they're standing against the majority of the population in an semi-insurrectionary situation. The next years after 1956, I mean, there are big concessions to the working class in the form of big wage increases for a couple of years, and then no more wage increases. But the working class is bought off with big wage increases, and then they're stopped. But they continue to pay out privileges to the layer below them, to tie the layer below them now to themselves, to extend the body of their rule, if you like, to the petty bureaucrats, the small factory managers, the under-managers, the lower levels of the civil service, the regional and the district and the local party officials. They were all of them, in 1956, in the reform wing and the oppositional wing, the opponents of the central political bureaucracy. In the period after 1956, the whole ruling class consolidates its position by extending its own privileges and so on, and guaranteeing privileges to a much bigger layer below itself. Of course, it's easier to do it now. There's been a whole expansion of the process of wealth creation as part of the process of industrialization in Poland. And so there's more goodies to share out anyway. But they corrupted, if you like, the next layer and tied them to them with bands of gold and offers of promotion and so on and so on. There's a new generation of people, many of them, who are now coming up into their late 20s and 30s and early 40s, and who are only too pleased, of course. Nobody minds being corrupted. It's just, the truth is that capitalism can't corrupt all of us. Otherwise it would do so. But you can corrupt a layer a crucial ruling layer below yourself and tie them to the ruling class. And they did so. So that when in 1970 you have another upsurge of workers' revolt in Szczecin and Gdansk and Gdynia, there is no shaking in the party that time. Absolutely none at all. There's no question of a big reform movement in the party. The party is united. The top officials, the middle officials, and the lower officials are completely united against the working class. A much bigger layer this time. And therefore, in a sense, in 1970, the crisis was much less for the Polish ruling class. I mean, Gomulka got kicked out. He was replaced by Gierek, who comes forward saying, of course, I am a real worker like you. I was brought up in the Silesian coal mines. Absolute bloody lies. Been living in a villa for years as a member of the Central Committee and driving around in the Polish equivalent of a Rolls Royce. But the fact is, he can talk the language of the workers. He comes to the workers and says, I am a worker like you. Will you help us? And also, very interesting, the sorts of people who were in the crowds of workers in Gdansk who shouted, yes, we will help you in 1970 to Gierek. They were called Lech Wałęsa, Anna Valentinovich, and so on. They were all there. They all described it in their own accounts of their own lives. We were all there shouting, yes, we will support the government. Hooray for Gierek. Gomulka was bad, but Gierek is good, and so on and so on. But, hang on, where are we? You see, what had happened between 1956 and 1970, the Polish economy had gone into stagnation again. The growth process gets more and more creaky. And Gierek tried something new in an effort to overcome the problem of the crisis-ridden character of the Polish economy. That it was stagnating and creaking, it was more and more difficult to raise productivity, more and more difficult to keep up the rate of growth. He makes an opening to the West. Tries something new, which he tried it more than, I mean, all the state capitalist ruling classes in the communist sphere, as it were, have made that move to some extent. Gierek overdid them all. He borrowed huge sums from the West. In the periods, towards the end of the world capitalist boom, Gierek goes to the world market and just borrows. He invites Western capital to invest in Poland. There's a great big factory outside Warsaw called the Ursus Tractor Factory, 50% owned by the Polish government, 50% owned by Massey Ferguson of Canada. I mean, very interesting for those who think that Poland is a socialist, because it means that, you know, the man who sounds the hooter in the Ursus factory is the most powerful man in the world. You know, they make surplus value for Massey Ferguson in the morning, and in the afternoon they produce something else, presumably, surplus product for the socialist community in the afternoon. They change the relations of production halfway through every day. It's 50%, it's half and half. And there are all sorts of enterprises in Poland of that sort. He borrowed and borrowed and borrowed. Unfortunately for Gierek, he wanted to have a sort of borrowing, a debt-led boom. And he had a boom, but then the boom ran into the sand and Poland's debt spiraled. And in the end, by the end of the 70s, Poland was one of the few industrialized countries in the world which actually had a really negative rate of growth. It had a collapse of production, in fact. In the end of something in the order of 20-30%. At the height of the crisis, a real collapse of production on the basis of over-borrowing. But anyway, I must stop. The comrade is waving at me. Just a couple of things. I just need to finish it quickly, and I will be very quick. They introduced, after 1970, as well as having this boom, they further consolidated their relationships with the petty functionaries. And they legalized many of the privileges. They actually introduced a state decree that a whole categories of people called the nomenclatura, the people who are on the list of names, it means, in other words, the ruling class, that their privileges were guaranteed now for life, regardless of what happened to them, unless they were actually tried in a criminal court. So that when Gomulka was kicked out in 1970, he continued to receive his bureaucrat's pension. Not only is he not shot, as he would have been in the Stalin period for failing, not only is he not arrested, but he's given a nice villa by the sea, and there's a decree that anybody in future that this happens to, their privileges are guaranteed. Their pension rights and a whole series of other things, salary rights and so on, even if they're kicked out of office, are guaranteed. Why? Because in 1956, they've had to have a turnover in the ruling personnel, and lots of them have been toppled. It's happened again in 1970. They're beginning to learn that the process through which you change governments in Poland is by mass riot. And so, you know, they begin to learn. They say, okay, let's guarantee ourselves against this. And they actually legalize their own situation. And not only for themselves, but for their children and their grandchildren. It's mentioned in the decree. It was annulled in 1980 officially, that decree. But it was a legal decree of the state. Secondly, they legalized their position as the ruling party. In 1976, they wrote it into the constitution of Poland that it's in the constitution that the Communist Party plays, or the United Workers' Party plays the leading role in Poland. And they enormously developed the system of privilege. Enormously. I mean, there isn't time. I'll just run through somebody in Solidarity put together some of the spheres of privilege which are notable, and I'll just run through them quickly to give you a sense of it, because it was part of the thing that Solidarity revolted against, the corruption of Polish society by the end of the 70s. But pay, as well as getting your salary, which of course is a much better salary than a worker, you also have, there's a thing called the envelope system, where they simply give you an envelope with a lot of money in it. You don't have to sign for it. They just give, here is an envelope. It's known as the envelope system. If you give an interview, your statement, you give a press statement because you're an official, you're given, when it's published in the newspaper, and the newspapers largely consist of official statements, you get a fat fee for your statement. If your housing is supplied by the state and consists of a villa on a private estate with a sign over the entrance to the estate, military area, keep out, there are armed guards to keep out the bloody plebs, etc., etc. In there you've got the latest thing from the West that's been imported, of course, on the workers' money. The surplus value that's been produced by the workers. There are jacuzzis and swimming pools and all the facilities of the University of London Union just for you, and so on and so on. On the walls are hanging treasures from the art museums, which are on loan to you because you're a member, you're a functionary of the regime, and so on and so on. After all, you might have to entertain an ambassador in your house, and so on and so on and so on. There's special shops for you to buy things that the rest of Polish society can't buy. Special shops that only you can go into if you've got the right card to show. They've got yellow curtains over the doors, and nobody can see inside. Only you can go inside. You get special access to imports from the West. Your kids certainly wear the best designer jeans. You don't have to buy a car. You're constantly testing a car for the car manufacturers. And when it's worn out, it's failed its test, and you have another one. You have luxury rest and holiday centres, including great areas of southern Poland which are closed to the public, which are private hunting areas for the regime, and so on and so on and so on. The head of Polish television